Silent killers once wiped out entire medieval villages without a trace. We are exploring 15 mysterious plagues that vanished without explanation, leaving behind only fragments of fear in old records. By the end, you will understand why their sudden disappearances are as unsettling as the diseases themselves. What strange force could make hundreds of people dance until they died? Why would a sickness target only the young and healthy, killing them in mere hours? This journey reveals how fragile our grasp on history and health truly is. What forgotten epidemic do you think could still be lurking in the shadows? A healthy merchant collapses on a bustling London street, his body drenched in a foul-smelling sweat. Within hours, he is dead, his skin bearing none of the telltale marks of the Black Death. This was the terrifying reality of the English sweating sickness. It erupted without warning in 1485, vanishing just as mysteriously after its fifth and final major outbreak in 1551. The disease seemed to have a cruel preference, targeting the young, the wealthy, and the robust. Imagine the terror in a community where strength was no longer an advantage but a death sentence. Tudor chroniclers like Polydore Virgil wrote of victims being seized with a profound sense of impending doom, a chilling prelude to the profuse sweating, crippling headaches, and agonizing heart pain that followed. In some towns, the mortality rate soared past 50%, emptying homes and streets with a speed that left survivors in a state of shock. What made this plague so baffling was its complete anonymity. Modern theories point to a possible hantavirus, a germ carried by rodents, or perhaps an unknown type of bacteria. Yet, without definitive evidence, these remain educated guesses. The greatest puzzle is not its arrival, but its departure. Why did it stop? Did a shift in the climate disrupt the rodents that may have carried it? Or did the pathogen itself evolve, becoming less deadly to ensure its own survival, simply fading into the background of common illnesses? This question hangs in the air, a reminder that a microscopic enemy can disappear as silently as it arrived, leaving us to wonder if the conditions for its return could ever align again. The ghost of the sweat set a haunting precedent for sudden, unexplained plagues, but it was not the only mysterious force to command the human body against its will. The streets of Strasbourg offered a spectacle more terrifying than any battlefield. In the oppressive summer of 1518, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into a public square and began to dance. This was not a celebration, it was a compulsion, a frantic, unstoppable motion that lasted for days. She could not cease, her body a prisoner to an invisible force. Within a week, her solitary mania had infected hundreds. The city was overtaken by a dancing plague, a choreomania that turned the streets into a stage of exhaustion and death. These people danced until their feet were raw and bloody. They danced through broken bones and sheer delirium, collapsing from heart attacks and strokes, their bodies simply giving out. The local government, utterly baffled, made a desperate and counterintuitive decision. They built wooden stages and hired musicians, believing the only cure was to let the victims dance the sickness out of their systems. This well-intentioned intervention only fueled the epidemic, providing a rhythm for their doom. What could cause a person to dance themselves to death? Historians like John Waller point to a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness. Imagine a community under immense psychological strain. Strasbourg had been ravaged by severe famine and recurring diseases. The collective fear and despair may have manifested in this physical outburst, a hysterical reaction to unbearable stress. Another compelling theory involves ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye, a staple grain. When consumed, it can cause severe muscle spasms, fever, and vivid hallucinations, symptoms that could be misinterpreted as a compulsive dance. Yet, neither theory is a perfect fit. Why did this happen here and then never again in the same way? Why did it stop? The dancing plague remains a stark lesson in the mind's terrifying power over the body, a physical expression of a community's silent screams. It forces us to ask what unseen pressures could make a human body turn so violently against itself. This bizarre affliction showed how stress could contort the body, but another mysterious sickness was already at work, one that targeted the very young and twisted their forms in a different, lasting way. The torment of St. Anthony's fire presented a different kind of medieval terror, one that crawled from the very breadbasket onto the dinner table. In 10th century France, and for centuries after, a mysterious affliction would descend upon entire villages. Peasants would be seized by a sensation of their limbs being set ablaze, a creeping fire that led to gangrene, turning their hands and feet black and brittle, sometimes falling away from the body entirely. Their minds were no refuge, filled with visions of demons and hellfire, a symptom that led the suffering to be named after Saint Anthony, the patron saint who was said to have resisted demonic temptations. Monastic orders dedicated to the saint became havens for these victims, offering care and prayers for a condition that seemed both physical and spiritual. We now know this holy fire was ergotism, a brutal poisoning caused by a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that infects damp rye. The biological mechanism is chillingly clear. The fungus produces powerful alkaloids that violently constrict blood flow, starving extremities and causing convulsions and vivid hallucinations. For hundreds of years, this hidden killer lurked in the staple grain of the poor. So why did it largely vanish by the 18th century? The answer is a quiet revolution in agriculture. Improved methods for storing grain kept it drier, making it less hospitable to the fungus. Farmers began to diversify their crops, and the introduction of the potato from the New World offered a new, safer staple, reducing the population's heavy reliance on dangerous rye. Yet the complete disappearance is still puzzling. The fungus itself never went away. This suggests that small, cumulative changes in farming, climate, and even the unknowing cultivation of more resistant rye strains created a perfect shield against an ancient scourge. It is a profound reminder that our health is deeply woven into the fabric of our land and what we choose to grow upon it. While St. Anthony's fire ravaged the body and mind with visible, gruesome symptoms, the next plague to haunt our history was a far more subtle thief, one that left its victims physically whole but stripped them of their very selves. 2 centuries after the English sweat vanished, a strange echo arose from the French countryside. In 1718, the region of Picardy was seized by a new malady, the Picardy Sweat. It mirrored its infamous predecessor with sudden fever and drenching sweats, yet it carried a distinctive, almost merciful difference. This sickness, known to local doctors as soute des Picards, was rarely a killer. Instead of swift death, it presented with a vivid rash, intense headaches, and deep muscle pain, afflicting thousands in wave after wave for nearly 200 years. The mystery deepens when you consider its confinement. Why did this illness, documented in over 190 separate outbreaks, never breach the borders of northern France? Was there something unique about the local environment or the people themselves that kept the sickness contained? Physicians of the era were utterly perplexed, debating whether it was a strange form of influenza or a completely unknown viral agent. Its gradual fade into obscurity by the early 20th century aligns with broader changes, the slow march of improved sanitation and better medical understanding. But this quiet departure is its own kind of puzzle. The pathogen responsible was never identified. Perhaps it was a germ that jumped from animals to humans, only to lose its potency over time. Or maybe the microbe mutated into a milder form, becoming one of the many common colds we dismiss today. The Picardy Sweat teaches us that not all plagues end with a bang. Some simply recede like a tide, leaving behind a quiet shore of unanswered questions. But the next plague on our journey was incapable of such subtlety. It was a storm that targeted the most vulnerable, arriving with a speed and ferocity that left entire towns grieving. The silence left behind by a plague of children is a particular kind of horror. While other sicknesses culled the old and the weak, certain 13th century outbreaks displayed a cruel and specific preference, hunting only the young. Chroniclers in Italy wrote of the puri decimati, the decimated children, where waves of disease swept through towns, leaving the adult population largely untouched but wiping out entire generations of the young. Monastic records are filled with sorrowful laments for these lost innocents, but they offer frustratingly few medical details, speaking more of the empty cradles than the specific symptoms that filled the graveyards. We can only reconstruct the terror from scant clues, imagining the high fevers and desperate respiratory distress that likely claimed these young lives. Historians and epidemiologists now piece together the puzzle from burial site analyses and stark population data drops. The most plausible explanation points to common viral foes we know today, like measles or influenza. In a time before widespread exposure, a child's naive immune system was a defenseless fortress, easily overrun by pathogens that older populations had already survived. So why did these specific, child-targeting plagues fade from the historical record? Their disappearance was likely a quiet victory for herd immunity. As these viruses became endemic, constantly circulating at low levels, each new generation built up defenses earlier in life, transforming a childhood killer into a common, manageable illness. Changes in living conditions that reduced intense crowding may have also slowed the explosive, deadly fires through vulnerable young populations, yet the haunting specificity remains. Was there a unique strain of a virus long since evolved into something milder that exclusively preyed on the young? Or were there environmental cofactors, some element of medieval childhood nutrition or exposure that made them the perfect target, a combination we simply do not encounter today? These lost young lives stand as a stark reminder that demography can be a death sentence, and that the immunity of a community is a shield forged in the memory of past losses. This chilling focus on a single segment of society makes the next plague seem even more bizarre, for it was a sickness that seemed to bypass the body almost entirely, targeting the human spirit with a symptom that was as inexplicable as it was terrifying, uncontrollable laughter. Laughter is not always a sign of joy. In some rare and terrifying instances, it can be a symptom of a collective sickness. While the most famous case occurred in modern Tanganyika, echoes of this bizarre phenomenon resonate through medieval folklore, where entire groups were said to be seized by fits of uncontrollable, hysterical laughter. Imagine a village where the sound of mirth becomes a sound of torment, where people laugh until they are breathless, their bodies aching, collapsing from sheer exhaustion. In a medieval context, such an event would have defied all explanation. Without a concept of mass psychogenic illness, the only logical conclusion for terrified onlookers would be demonic possession or a divine curse. Chroniclers might have written of a madness sent from the stars or a punishment for collective sin, their records blending medical mystery with moral judgment, much like the interpretations of the dancing plague. The mechanism, as explained by experts like Dr. Christian Hempelmann, is one of the mind's immense power over the body. Under periods of intense social stress, anxiety, or fear, the human psyche can sometimes short-circuit, translating psychological pressure into a physical symptom shared by a whole community. Laughter, an expression we associate with release, becomes a prison. The outbreak typically ends only when the underlying stress is removed or the group is separated, breaking the invisible chain of hysteria. Yet, this resolution only deepens the mystery of its disappearance from history. Why do these specific psychic epidemics vanish without a trace? The answer may lie in their very nature. They are not caused by a germ that can be tracked, but by a unique and fleeting convergence of social tension and cultural belief. Once that specific moment passes, the script for the sickness is forgotten, leaving behind only baffling stories that challenge our understanding of reality itself. It forces us to ask where the line truly lies between a sickness of the body and a fever of the mind. This eerie affliction showed how emotions could become contagious, but our next plague was a stark reminder that the body itself could be reshaped by an unseen foe, twisting its victims into forms that seem to defy nature. A society's collapse could begin not with a human cough, but with the lowing of a dying cow. Medieval Europe was periodically shattered by cattle plagues, mysterious epidemics that swept through herds with a brutality that rivaled the Black Death. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a great mortality among beasts, a phrase that barely captures the scale of the devastation. When the plough oxen and dairy cows died, the foundation of medieval life crumbled. Fields lay fallow without animals to pull the ploughs. Milk and cheese, staples of the peasant diet, vanished. Famine inevitably followed, weakening human populations and making them vulnerable to the next wave of sickness. This was a domino effect of disaster where an animal illness could trigger a human catastrophe. The pathogens behind these events were complete mysteries. They were likely viral foes similar to rinderpest or foot and mouth disease, causing high fevers, discharges, and severe lesions in the cattle, leading to a swift and gruesome death. Without any understanding of virology, medieval farmers could only watch in helpless horror as their wealth and security died before their eyes. So how did these devastating plagues fade away? Their disappearance is a story written not in medical texts, but in the quiet evolution of agriculture. Over centuries, farming practices slowly changed. The enclosure of fields and the development of more isolated pastures reduced the contact between herds, breaking the chains of transmission. Selective breeding may have unconsciously favored animals with greater natural resistance, building more resilient livestock populations over generations. It is also possible the pathogens themselves evolved, trading their deadliness for longevity, becoming endemic childhood diseases for cattle that no longer wiped out entire populations. This is the core concept of zoonosis, the jumping of a disease from animals to humans, and its reverse. A cattle plague that disappears might mean the pathogen went extinct, finding no new hosts to conquer. Or it could have adapted so perfectly it became a mild, persistent presence we would never notice today. The fate of human societies was, and still is, inextricably linked to the health of the animals they depend upon. While these agricultural disasters arrived without warning, another human sickness was noted for its strange predictability, a plague that kept to a strict seasonal schedule before it too vanished from the world. Spring arrived with a different kind of penitence behind monastery walls. As the snow melted, a predictable malaise settled over the cloisters, a recurring sickness the monks meticulously recorded as the Vernal Fever. Each year, as the world outside burst into life, those within would be struck by profound lethargy, aching joints, and a low, steady fever that claimed a few lives before vanishing with the summer heat. To the devout, this pattern was a spiritual puzzle, a divine test of their faith or perhaps a punishment carried on the spring mists they called bad air. The true cause was likely rooted not in the heavens but in the very earth awakening around them. These secluded communities, often set in wooded areas, were perfect targets for tick-borne illnesses similar to what we now call Lyme disease. The monks' daily routines of gardening, prayer in grassy fields, and tending to livestock would have placed them directly in the path of these tiny parasites. Alternatively, a seasonal virus circulating in local rodent populations could have found an easy home in the close quarters life of the monastery, flaring up each year with the change of the seasons. The mystery of its end is as quiet as the plague itself. The gradual cooling of the Little Ice Age may have disrupted the habitats and life cycles of the ticks that carried the sickness. Changes within the monasteries themselves, like improved diets or better waste management, could have slowly broken the chain of transmission. Since the illness was so tightly confined to these isolated communities, it needed only a small shift in routine or environment to fade away completely. It simply lost its foothold. This leaves us with a profound question. How many other mild, seasonal pathogens cycled through isolated human populations for centuries, only to vanish without a trace when our ways of living subtly changed? These vernal fevers represent a lost chapter in our relationship with microbes, a whisper of a time when a sickness could be as regular as the equinox and just as fleeting. But the next plague offered no such gentle rhythm. Its arrival was a violent shock, marking its victims with a horrifying and unmistakable signature across their skin. A strange new plague arrived in Europe as the 15th century drew to a close, one that scarred both the body and the historical record. This was the Great Pox, a name that evokes the familiar horror of smallpox, but the symptoms described by physicians of the era tell a more complicated and terrifying story. While we often equate it with syphilis, the disease that swept through cities like Naples presented with a ferocity that seems alien even to modern understanding. Victims suffered from rapid, disfiguring ulcerations that ate away at the flesh, often accompanied by a swift and severe neurological decline that led to madness and paralysis. This was not the slow, insidious progression of classic syphilis. It was a storm that ravaged its victims with breathtaking speed. Contemporary accounts, like the vivid writings of the German knight Ulrich von Hutten, who was a sufferer himself, detail painful treatments that proved utterly useless. Doctors imported guaiacum wood from the New World, believed to be a holy wood with curative powers. Patients would endure a strict regimen of drinking potions made from this wood while being subjected to intense heat, a process that did little more than torment the sick. The failure of this celebrated cure strongly suggests they were not fighting the pathogen they thought they were. This particular strain, or perhaps this entirely different disease, possessed a unique virulence that the medicine of the day could not comprehend. So what was this great pox that came and went? Some scholars argue it was an exceptionally aggressive and now extinct strain of the syphilis bacterium, one that burned too hot and too fast, ultimately dying out with its host. Others propose it was a completely different pathogen altogether, a cousin to syphilis that caused similar but far more acute symptoms. Its disappearance from the medical landscape is as mysterious as its arrival. Perhaps it was a victim of its own success, a germ so deadly it ran out of susceptible hosts before it could become endemic. Alternatively, the slow, inadvertent improvements in public hygiene and the eventual use of mercury treatments, while toxic, may have accidentally targeted this specific variant, driving it to extinction through a form of microbial competition. This ambiguity forces us to confront a fundamental truth about medieval medicine. A single name in an old text like the Great Pox could be a blanket term for several different horrors. their true identities forever lost to time. The disappearance of such a virulent sickness offers a strange kind of hope, a reminder that not all deadly pathogens are destined to remain with us forever. Some simply vanish, leaving behind only their grim reputation and a lingering question about what exactly we managed to survive. Yet, as one plague faded, another was already preying on the human senses in a far more subtle and disorienting way, a sickness that twisted perception itself. Some afflictions left their marks on the skin, but others invaded the sanctuary of the mind through the ears. Across scattered regions of medieval Germany and France, a bizarre phenomenon surfaced in the records, a hearing plague where the world became a prison of unbearable noise. Victims reported a sudden onset of intense tinnitus, a constant ringing that soon twisted into the phantom clanging of bells or even the sound of distant, screaming voices. This auditory torment was often paired with crippling vertigo and relentless nausea, a combination that made standing, let alone working, an impossibility. The social consequence was a profound isolation. These sufferers were often shunned by their communities, seen as either cursed or mad, left to deteriorate in lonely rooms. Their deaths, when they came, were rarely from the condition itself, but from the secondary effects of starvation, dehydration, or sheer despair. The most baffling part for the physicians of the day was the autopsy. When they finally examined a body, they found nothing. No lesion in the ear, no obvious brain fever, no physical cause to explain the torture that had so clearly consumed the person. Modern analysis offers two compelling, yet unproven, theories. This could have been an extreme form of mass psychogenic illness, where collective trauma or unspoken anxieties manifested as a shared physical symptom, in this case a hallucination of sound. In a world filled with very real threats, the mind might have created a demon everyone could hear. Alternatively, it might have been a biological attack by an unknown neurotropic virus, a germ that specifically targeted the auditory cortex and the body's balance centers. The symptoms bear a striking resemblance to severe vestibular migraines or certain viral infections that can cause sudden hearing disturbances. The plague's transient nature, however, points strongly to an environmental trigger that simply went away. Perhaps a toxic mold like the infamous ergot contaminated a widespread grain supply for a few seasons, causing neurological damage that presented as auditory hell. Or maybe the collective trauma of a specific event, a war or a brutal famine, generated this shared hysterical response, a sickness that faded as the memory of the trauma itself softened over generations. Its status as a mere ghost in medical history is secured by the lack of sustained records. It appears in fragments, a curiosity noted by a local monk or a town clerk before vanishing from the page. This forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. How many other sensory plagues have haunted humanity? Diseases that twisted sight, smell, or touch, only to recede without leaving a physical trace for archaeologists to find. Their battlefield was the nervous system itself, and when they retreated, they took all their evidence with them. If a plague could make the very act of hearing a form of torture, then perhaps any of our senses could be the next target for a forgotten enemy. This invisible assault on the senses gave way to a plague that was tragically, undeniably visible, one that did not haunt the mind but slowly consumed the body from the outside in. The human body's largest organ could become its own shroud. In 14th century England, a strange affliction known only as the scaling sickness turned skin into a brittle parchment, peeling away in large, painful sheets. Parish registers from isolated villages recorded this horror with grim simplicity, noting deaths from a malady that left its victims raw and exposed. The loss of the skin's protective barrier led to a cruel demise from dehydration or rampant infection. a fate that seemed to strike at random within a community before vanishing from the record as quietly as it arrived. This was not a plague of crowds and cities, but a hyper-localized nightmare. Its confinement to specific villages is a major clue. One compelling theory points to a severe staphylococcal infection, a condition modern medicine knows as toxic epidermal necrolysis, where the body's response to a medication or pathogen causes the skin to detach. Yet in a medieval village, what could have been the trigger? Another possibility is a transient autoimmune storm, where an unknown agent, perhaps a peculiar mold on the local grain or a virus, temporarily confused the body's defenses into attacking itself. The most haunting explanation, however, lies in the very isolation of these communities. In a small, genetically closed village, a rare hereditary disorder could have been amplified through generations of intermarriage. A single genetic quirk, normally recessive and harmless, might have been expressed in dozens of people at once, creating the illusion of a contagious outbreak when it was really a tragic coincidence of ancestry. The disease's disappearance, then, might not be a medical mystery but a demographic one. Perhaps a few key carriers of the gene simply died without passing it on, or newcomers to the village diluted the genetic pool, effectively erasing the condition from existence. The scaling sickness stands as a stark reminder that an epidemic does not need to span continents to be devastating. Some of history's most puzzling illnesses were intimate tragedies, their secrets buried with the last member of a secluded community. Yet, while this plague was rooted in the physical body, the next great terror was seen as something written in the stars themselves, a sickness that blurred the line between celestial event and earthly suffering. A streak of fire in the night sky was never just a celestial event. It was a portent of doom. When Halley's comet blazed over England in 1066, chroniclers did not see a ball of ice and rock. They saw an omen, and soon after, a strange respiratory plague descended. They called it the comet's fever, a sickness marked by relentless coughing and high fevers that swept through the population before vanishing as inexplicably as the comet itself. For the medieval mind, this was not a coincidence, it was causation. The heavens were a divine text, and a comet was a sentence of judgment written in fire. This pattern repeated for centuries, with astrological events blamed for outbreaks of all kinds. The real mystery is not why they made the connection, but why these specific omen-linked plagues seemed to disappear from the records. One compelling reason is the slow march of rationalism. As record-keeping improved and scientific thought advanced, physicians stopped looking to the stars for blame and started looking at patterns of contagion on the ground. A comet might still appear, but if no notable outbreak followed, it was no longer recorded as a plague. The superstition itself began to fade, and with it, the named diseases it created. More fundamentally, these plagues were likely common, short-lived respiratory viruses that simply burned out. In a world without global travel, a pathogen could emerge, race through a susceptible population, and then hit an evolutionary dead end, disappearing forever. The comet's fever was probably one of 1,000 such minor epidemics, notable only because it was immortalized by a celestial coincidence. This reveals a profound human need to find patterns, to impose a narrative of meaning onto the random brutality of nature. We sought a reason for our suffering, even if that reason was a distant, icy wanderer. As we learned to stop blaming the stars, we could finally confront the plagues that were undeniably, terrifyingly of this earth, like the one that made human bones turn to glass. The very framework of the human body could betray its owner without warning. In the cold reaches of medieval Scandinavia, a terrifying malady known as the bone shaker's disease turned simple existence into a perilous ordeal. Victims would suffer sudden, agonizing fractures from the most mundane acts. a bone snapping from the strain of lifting a cup or turning in bed, their bodies becoming their own prisons of pain and profound weakness. This was more than just brittle bones. It was an acute, sweeping epidemic that appeared in communities and then disappeared entirely by the 16th century. Modern analysis suggests a condition similar to a virulent form of osteoporosis, where bone density vanishes at an alarming rate. But what could cause such a rapid collapse of the skeleton on an epidemic scale? The most plausible theory points to a perfect storm of nutritional disaster. In an era of frequent famine, severe vitamin C deficiency, or scurvy, would have halted the body's ability to maintain collagen, the essential scaffold for bone. Combine this with a lack of vitamin D from long, dark winters, and you have a population whose bones were already silently crumbling. Yet, the epidemic nature hints at something more. Perhaps an unknown infectious agent, a virus, swept through these malnourished communities, one that specifically attacked the body's intricate system for regulating calcium, pushing weakened bones past their breaking point. The haunting lack of evidence is its own kind of clue. Why do mass graves from the period not show the telltale signs of such catastrophic fractures? The answer is as grim as the disease itself. The bone shaker's victims likely perished not from the fractures, but from the secondary infections and immobility that followed, their bodies interred before archaeologists could find the proof. The malady's quiet retreat may simply be the story of better harvests. The slow introduction of new crops and more reliable food sources could have ended the widespread nutritional deficiencies that made the population so vulnerable, allowing the skeleton of society to heal. This plague demonstrates that an enemy does not need to be flashy to be devastating. It can work in the dark, leaching strength from within until the body can no longer hold itself up. But if a disease could convince a person their very bones were breaking, what kind of sickness could persuade them they were no longer flesh and blood at all, but something fragile and transparent? The belief that your own body is no longer flesh and bone, but a fragile, transparent vessel, is a terror of a different order. Long before kings feared shattering in the 17th century, medieval monasteries and courts recorded strange clusters of individuals gripped by the Glass Delusion. These sufferers were convinced they were made of glass, living in a state of perpetual, paralyzing caution. They might refuse to sit down, fearing their buttocks would crack, or insist on being carried on pillows, terrified a sudden jolt would shatter them into 1,000 pieces. The consequence was often a slow, agonizing decline through starvation or self-inflicted injury, a physical suffering born entirely from a fixed and unshakable idea. Historians like Dr. Jennifer Radden see this not as a physical contagion, but as a cognitive epidemic. In an environment of extreme societal stress, perhaps the rigid expectations of monastic life or the perilous intrigues of a royal court, an underlying anxiety disorder could magnify into a shared delusion. It was a sickness of context where the pressure to maintain a perfect facade literally translated into the fear of being transparent and fragile. So why did this particular psychological plague fade from view? Its disappearance likely coincides with a profound shift in how society classified such suffering. As medical understanding slowly evolved, the Glass Delusion was no longer seen as a mysterious communal affliction, but was reclassified under the broader, isolating umbrella of insanity. The cultural narrative changed, and the script for this specific form of hysterical expression was forgotten. This cognitive epidemic forces us to confront a chilling reality. A plague does not need a virus to spread. Sometimes an idea alone is enough to make a human being starve themselves out of the fear of breaking. It blurs the line between a sickness of the body and a fever of the mind, leaving us to wonder what beliefs in our own time could become just as contagious. As we approach the final mystery on our list, we move from a plague that made people fear they would shatter to one that convinced them they were crumbling from within, as if decades of life were compressed into a matter of days. Youth itself could be stolen in a matter of weeks. The final and perhaps most personal of these forgotten terrors is the rapid aging syndrome, a condition where vibrant young men and women would watch in horror as their own bodies betrayed them. Their skin would crease with deep wrinkles, their hair would turn a stark white, and a profound weakness would settle into their bones, all while they were still in the prime of life. These individuals did not just look old, they became old, dying from the sheer exhaustion and organ failure of extreme age while still in their 20s. The most baffling aspect, noted in the rare physicians' journals that mention it, was the complete absence of any family history. This was not a curse passed down through bloodlines, it was a thief that struck at random. Modern science offers a few haunting possibilities. It could have been a devastating viral infection that hijacked the body's cellular machinery, accelerating the process of telomere shortening, the protective caps on our chromosomes that naturally wear down as we age. Another, more unsettling theory involves a prion disease, a misfolded protein that acts like a contagion, triggering a catastrophic chain reaction in the body's tissues, effectively making it consume itself from the inside out. The condition's episodic nature, however, is the core of the mystery. Why did it appear in clusters and then vanish? The pathogen responsible may have been a master of its own demise, a germ that mutated so rapidly it lost its deadly function, becoming a harmless passenger in our biological landscape. Or perhaps the cases we have in the records were a tragic misdiagnosis, a perfect storm of separate, known illnesses like severe autoimmune disorders or hormonal collapses that together mimicked the rapid march of time. This final plague forces a profound confrontation with the very nature of our existence. It reveals that the steady, predictable pace of a human life is not a given, but a delicate biological balance, one that a microscopic intruder could, in theory, shatter completely. And with that haunting thought, we are left to ask the ultimate question that binds all 15 of these mysteries together. Why did they leave 15 silent epidemics, each with its own terrifying signature, all share a single profound end? They vanished. Looking back across this graveyard of forgotten diseases, we can now trace the common paths that led to their disappearance, revealing the fragile balance between humanity and the microscopic world. The environment itself was often the deciding factor. As the Little Ice Age gripped the globe, its colder temperatures and altered ecosystems disrupted the habitats of the very creatures that carried sickness. The ticks responsible for the vernal fevers in monasteries, or the rodents that may have harbored the English sweat, found their world shrinking, breaking the chain of transmission without a single human intervention. A pathogen can also be a victim of its own success. Some of these plagues, particularly those that struck with horrific speed, simply burned too hot. They moved through a population so rapidly, killing their hosts before they could travel far, that they exhausted their own fuel supply. The most susceptible individuals died, leaving behind those with natural resistance, and the fire of the epidemic sputtered out. This is the cruel logic of a deadly germ, one that can evolve into a milder form simply to survive. A virus that allows its host to live and walk around is far more successful than one that kills in a day. Many of these vanished sicknesses may have done just that, mutating into the background noise of common colds and minor fevers we still experience today. Then there are the plagues of the mind, the dancing manias and hearing sicknesses. Their disappearance was tied not to climate or mutation, but to the evolution of society itself. The unique societal pressures that created them, the perfect storm of famine, fear, and collective belief, eventually shifted. As living conditions slowly improved and the cultural narrative changed, the script for these psychogenic illnesses was lost, their symptoms no longer making sense to a new generation. Quiet, accidental public health measures played a massive, uncelebrated role. The slow improvement in grain storage that defeated St. Anthony's fire, the diversification of crops that reduced reliance on contaminated rye, and even the simple act of enclosing fields to contain cattle plagues, all created invisible shield. In a world without global travel, these local victories stayed local. An outbreak could consume a village or a region and then hit a dead end, dying out completely because there was no next town, no next country to leap to. This natural extinction of pathogens is a process as old as life itself. Our battle with disease is not a static war but a constantly shifting landscape. For every plague we have named and fought, there were countless others that simply faded away, their departure as mysterious as their arrival. This history of disappearance is not just a record of past luck, it is a profound lesson. It tells us that the conditions for a plague's return are not fixed in stone, but are written in the living world around us, in our climate, our food, and the very structure of our societies. The shadows of history are deep, and they may still hold secrets we have yet to encounter. These 15 silent epidemics leave us with a humbling truth that nature holds mysteries we may never fully solve. From the English sweat to the rapid aging syndrome, each disappearance reveals the delicate dance between humanity, the pathogens that prey upon us, and the world we share. It is a dynamic and often unpredictable relationship, one where a slight shift in the climate, a new farming technique, or the simple evolution of a germ can rewrite our entire history. These stories are not just relics, they are urgent reminders to remain vigilant. Understanding why these plagues vanished could provide the very clues we need to confront the emerging diseases of our own time. The past whispers warnings we would be wise to hear. As we close this chapter, I am curious to know which of these forgotten plagues captured your imagination the most. Was it the compulsive dance of Strasbourg or the chilling swiftness of the sweating sickness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of history. If you found these enigmas as compelling as I do, subscribe for more deep dives into the past and let us continue unraveling its greatest mysteries.